Her husband laughed as he signed the divorce papers, not knowing the very next document would turn his victory into his greatest humiliation. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just watched, because deep down, she knew something he didn't. And when the lawyer opened that envelope, the room went silent. By the time the truth was revealed, everyone realized this wasn't just a divorce. It was about revenge, resilience, and a secret buried for 12 years. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. October 14th, 2023. A courtroom in downtown Chicago. The air thick with tension and expensive cologne. On one side of the mahogany table sat Alexander Bennett, 43, in a custom Italian suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His attorney, Marcus Reed, was arranging papers with the kind of precision that comes from winning. On the other side sat Naomi Bennett, 39, in a simple grey dress, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable, no tears, no trembling. Just an eerie calm that made the paralegal in the corner glance at her twice. Alexander leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against the armrest like a man who'd already won. He whispered something to Marcus, and they both smirked. The kind of smirk that makes your stomach turn. But Naomi didn't flinch. She just stared at the stack of papers between them, her wedding ring already gone, a pale circle of skin marking where it used to be. The judge hadn't arrived yet. The room hummed with the low murmur of legal jargon and shuffling feet, and in that moment, no one in that room, not the lawyers, not the clerks, not even Alexander himself, understood what was really about to happen, because Naomi had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone could imagine. 12 years earlier, Naomi Carter met Alexander Bennett at a business seminar in Boston. She was 27, working 2 jobs to pay off student loans from her marketing degree. He was 31. Charming, ambitious, and talking about launching a consulting firm that would change the industry. They connected over coffee that turned into dinner that turned into late-night conversations about dreams and risk and building something that mattered. 6 months later, they were married in a small ceremony by the lake, just family and close friends. Alexander's business was still in its infancy, barely breaking even. Naomi believed in him when no one else did. She quit her stable job to help him full-time, no salary, no title, just a promise that once the company took off, they'd build their future together. She wasn't just his wife. She was the backbone of everything he called success. Late nights in their cramped apartment, Naomi would sit at the kitchen table with spreadsheets and client proposals while Alexander pitched to investors. She designed the marketing campaigns, managed the budgets, handled the vendors, even wrote the speeches he delivered at conferences. When they finally landed their first major client, a Fortune 500 tech company, Alexander celebrated with champagne and press interviews. Naomi celebrated by collapsing into bed at 2 in the morning, exhausted, invisible. The company grew. Within 5 years, Bennett Consulting Group had offices in 3 cities and annual revenue in the millions. Alexander's face appeared in business magazines. He was invited to speak at Harvard, at Stanford, at panels about entrepreneurship and grit. He'd stand on those stages in his tailored suits and talk about vision and sacrifice. But he never mentioned Naomi. Not once. At home, things shifted. Alexander started working late, traveling more, coming home, smelling like perfume that wasn't hers. He'd brush it off, say it was client dinners, networking events, part of the game. Naomi wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man she married was still in there somewhere beneath the designer clothes and the ego. But then she started noticing the small things. Text messages he'd delete, calls he'd take in another room, the way he looked at Jessica, his director of operations, during company meetings. Jessica had joined the firm 3 years into its growth, sharp, polished, always laughing a little too loud at Alexander's jokes. Naomi had hired her. Naomi had mentored her. And now, Naomi watched as her husband's hand lingered on Jessica's shoulder just a second too long during the company holiday party. She didn't confront him, not yet, because somewhere deep inside, Naomi had already started preparing. Every signature he claimed as power, she quietly documented as proof. Back in the courtroom, October 2023, the judge finally entered. Everyone rose. The Honorable Judge Patricia Callahan, mid-50s, no nonsense, the kind of woman who'd seen every trick in the divorce playbook. She sat, adjusted her glasses, and gestured for everyone to proceed. Marcus Reed stood first, smooth and rehearsed. Your Honor, this is a straightforward dissolution of marriage. My client, Mr. Bennett, and Mrs. Bennett have agreed to the terms outlined in their prenuptial agreement, signed in 2011. No children, no contested assets. We're simply here to finalize. Judge Callahan glanced at Naomi. Mrs. Bennett, is that your understanding? Naomi's attorney, a woman named Claire Donovan, mid-40s, sharp eyes and a reputation for taking on impossible cases, stood before Naomi could speak. Your Honor, my client does acknowledge the prenuptial agreement. However, there are additional documents that need to be entered into evidence before we proceed. Alexander's smirk widened. He leaned toward Marcus and muttered something that made the attorney chuckle under his breath. Judge Callahan frowned. What documents? Claire reached into her briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope, thick, sealed. She walked it to the bench. Your Honor, these are copies of amended filings, financial records, and a legal addendum to the original prenuptial agreement that Mr. Bennett either forgot about or chose to ignore. The room stilled. Alexander's smirk faltered. Marcus sat up straighter, his pen frozen mid-note. Judge Callahan opened the envelope, pulled out the papers, and began reading. The silence stretched long enough that the court reporter shifted in her seat. Naomi sat perfectly still, her hands still folded, her expression unreadable. And as the judge adjusted her glasses and flipped to the second page, Naomi whispered something so quietly that only Alexander heard it. You should have read the fine print. His face went pale. If this story has your heart racing, comment, I'm still watching. Let's see who's truly following till the end. 2 years before the divorce, Naomi had started to suspect that Alexander wasn't just cheating, he was planning. She'd overheard a phone call late one night when he thought she was asleep. He was talking to Marcus Reed, his attorney, about asset protection, about making sure the business stayed untouchable, about timing. That's when Naomi realized he wasn't just having an affair. He was preparing to leave her with nothing. She could have confronted him. She could have screamed, thrown things, demanded answers. But Naomi had learned something in 12 years of being married to Alexander Bennett. Emotion was a weakness he could exploit. So instead, she got smart. She started with her old mentor, a woman named Dr. Linda Perez, a law professor Naomi had studied under in college. Linda had always told her students that knowledge was power, but documentation was a weapon. Naomi called her, explained the situation, and asked for help. Linda didn't hesitate. Over the next 18 months, Naomi quietly built her case. She retrieved old emails from the company server, ones that showed her contributions to Bennett Consulting Group, proposals she'd written, strategies she'd designed, clients she'd personally brought in. She found text messages Alexander had sent to investors, messages where he referenced Naomi's work, but claimed it as his own. She discovered that the prenuptial agreement they'd signed in 2011 had been drafted in a rush, just weeks before the wedding. When Naomi was overwhelmed with planning and Alexander's business was on the verge of collapse, she'd signed it without reading it fully, trusting him, trusting that they were building something together. But Linda found something else, a clause buried in the fine print, a clause that said if either party contributed to the growth of a jointly owned asset during the marriage, that contribution must be legally acknowledged and compensated in the event of dissolution. At the time they signed the prenup, Alexander's company was barely worth $50,000. Now it was worth over $40 million. And Naomi had documentation proving that her work, her ideas, her unpaid labor had been foundational to that growth. But there was more. In 2017, 6 years into the marriage, Naomi and Alexander had amended the prenup. She'd been pregnant at the time, a brief, heartbreaking pregnancy that ended in miscarriage at 12 weeks. During that period, Alexander had been caring, attentive, almost like the man she married. He'd suggested they update their legal documents to reflect their partnership, to protect each other. Naomi had signed the amendment, but Alexander had signed something different. Linda discovered that the version Alexander signed had been altered. His signature was on a document that removed Naomi's protections, that shifted ownership of shared assets entirely to him. He'd forged her consent, and that was a felony. Naomi spent nights alone in their guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of betrayal like a stone in her chest. She didn't tell her friends, she didn't tell her family. She just kept gathering evidence, kept meeting with Claire Donovan, kept preparing for the moment when Alexander would think he'd won. The paper he thought protected him was the same one that would dismantle his empire. Judge Callahan set the documents down. Her expression had shifted from neutral to something close to disbelief. She looked at Alexander, then at Marcus, then back at the papers. "Mr. Reed, did your client disclose the 2017 amendment to the prenuptial agreement?" Marcus blinked. He glanced at Alexander, who was now gripping the edge of the table. Your Honor, I was not made aware of any amendment beyond the original 2011 document." Judge Callahan's jaw tightened. "According to these records, Mr. Bennett, you and Mrs. Bennett signed an amended agreement in 2017 that explicitly acknowledged her financial and intellectual contributions to Bennett Consulting Group. This amendment states that in the event of divorce, Mrs. Bennett is entitled to 40% ownership of the company and all related assets." Alexander shot to his feet. "That's not... I didn't. That document was never finalized. Sit down, Mr. Bennett." Judge Callahan's voice was ice. Claire Donovan stepped forward, calm, precise. "Your Honor, the document was finalized. It was notarized, filed with the county clerk, and legally binding. What Mr. Bennett may not have realized is that the version he altered and presented to my client was fraudulent. We have the original notarized copy, complete with timestamps and witness signatures." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Marcus was flipping through his own files, his face red. Alexander was shaking his head, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find words. Judge Callahan held up a hand for silence. She looked directly at Alexander. "Mr. Bennett, did you knowingly present your wife with a falsified legal document?" "No. This is a misunderstanding." "It's not a misunderstanding, Your Honor." Claire's voice cut through the noise. "It's fraud, and we have evidence that Mr. Bennett used company resources built in part by my client, to fund personal expenses, including gifts and trips for his extramarital relationship with Miss Jessica Torres, his director of operations." Naomi finally looked at Alexander, not with anger, not with triumph, just with a quiet, devastating certainty. Alexander sank back into his chair. His hands were trembling. Marcus was whispering urgently in his ear, but it was too late. Judge Callahan closed the file. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm ordering a full forensic audit of Bennett Consulting Group, Mrs. Bennett's claim to ownership and compensation will be evaluated under the terms of the 2017 amendment, which I am recognizing as valid and binding. Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for potential fraud charges against Mr. Bennett." She looked at Naomi. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm granting a temporary injunction, freezing all major assets of Bennett Consulting Group until this matter is resolved." Alexander's empire, the one he'd built on Naomi's back and protected with lies, was crumbling in real time. He laughed when he signed, but the court didn't. 3 months later, the forensic audit confirmed everything. Naomi had contributed not just labor, but strategic direction, client relationships, and intellectual property that had generated millions in revenue. The court ruled that she was entitled to 42% ownership of Bennett Consulting Group, plus back compensation for 12 years of unpaid work, totaling just over $6 million. Alexander was charged with fraud and forgery. He pled guilty to avoid trial, received 2 years probation, community service, and a permanent stain on his professional reputation. Jessica Torres resigned quietly, her name now linked to a scandal she'd never escape. Bennett Consulting Group rebranded. Naomi didn't stay involved in daily operations. She didn't want to, but she made sure her name was on every legal document, every contract, every piece of the foundation she'd built. She sold her shares a year later to a private equity firm and used the money to start a non-profit helping women leaving abusive or exploitative marriages, offering legal support, financial literacy, and mentorship. She named it The Quiet Fight, because that's what it had been. Not loud, not violent, just relentless, patient, and rooted in truth. Naomi never remarried. She didn't need to. She'd spent 12 years building someone else's dream. Now she was building her own. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it waits quietly until the truth speaks. So let me ask you this. If you were in Naomi's position, would you have fought back the way she did, or would you have walked away the moment you knew? Would you have had the patience to document everything, to wait, to let him think he'd won? And what about Alexander? Was he a villain, or just a man who got lost in his own success? Do people like him deserve a second chance, or do they deserve exactly what they got? Think about the people in your life, the ones who've supported you when you had nothing. Have you acknowledged them? Have you honored their sacrifice? Or have you, like Alexander, convinced yourself that your success is yours alone? This story isn't just about a divorce. It's about power, about recognition, about the invisible labor that holds empires together. It's about what happens when that labor finally demands to be seen. Comment below and tell me, was this fate or was this foresight? Was Naomi lucky, or was she just better prepared than anyone gave her credit for? And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something real, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and stay tuned. Because the next story we're covering, it'll shake you even harder. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.